thunder shattered the sky above them, while lightning forked across the prairie without shelter. Mosquitoes became nightmares, biting until blood covered skin and sleep became nearly impossible. Supplies needed constant protection from humidity and heat. Clothing tore, weapons rusted, and journals risked damage from rain. The expedition learned to work like a machine, hunting at dawn, repairing boats at midday, taking scientific notes at evening, and planning strategy at night. Communication with native groups became increasingly important. Lewis and Clark knew peaceful diplomacy remained the only long-term survival strategy. Rumors spread that the Teton Sioux, an influential Lakota tribe along the upcoming river stretch, resisted foreigners entering their territory. Some traders warned that conflict was inevitable. Others insisted diplomacy could succeed if approached with respect. The captains prepared carefully, ordering discipline among the men and organizing gifts for chiefs. The tension building ahead felt heavy because the Teton Sioux controlled the gateway farther west. If the meeting failed, the Corps could be destroyed, captured, or forced to return home. Still, hope guided them. The Corps believed that good intentions, honesty, and intelligence could overcome fear. As September approached, the expedition entered one of the most dangerous diplomatic tests of the entire journey, one that would shape their future relationships with native peoples and influence American history for generations. By late September of 1804, the Corps of Discovery approached one of the most politically complex stretches of their entire journey, Teton Sioux territory. Unlike the earlier tribes they had met, the Teton Sioux Lakota held dominant control over the Missouri River trade routes. They had long interacted with French and Spanish traders, understood the power of negotiation, and possessed strong military traditions. Men who once strained their muscles rowing felt the unusual sensation of effortless movement. Speed doubled, sometimes tripled, as the river widened and deepened. It felt as if the land itself wanted to push them onward toward the Pacific Ocean. This new momentum electrified the Corps, bringing laughter where exhaustion once lingered. Yet the Columbia was not gentle. Rapids appeared frequently, exploding into white water capable of splintering canoes. One misjudged steering motion meant capsizing and death. Lewis noted that river navigation demanded razor-sharp focus. The current could shift direction suddenly, spinning boats into rock faces or forcing them sideways into dangerous whirlpools. Sacagawea continued demonstrating her worth by staying calm during intense rapids, securing loose items and keeping her infant safe when the boats plunged through chaotic waves. The landscape astonished them. Towering cliffs dominated both sides of the river. Great, jagged walls formed from volcanic basalt millions of years earlier. Wind whipped across canyon corridors, whistling like music through cracks in stone. The Corps passed waterfalls pouring down cliff sides, their spray drifting into the river like misty smoke. Lewis marveled at strange new plants, including towering pines, mosses clinging to rock, and forests changing color as autumn deepened. Salmon swam upriver in astonishing numbers, so thick that the river appeared alive beneath their canoes. The men tried catching fish, but found them too exhausted from spawning to taste good. River villages appeared along sandy shores, built by Chinookan-speaking tribes whose culture centered strongly around salmon and trade. Their houses, made of cedar planks, looked unlike any structures the Corps had seen before. Rectangular, large enough for extended families, with smoke holes carved into roofing. The people wore woven hats and clothing made from bark and plant fibers, intricately designed to repel rain. They crafted carved paddles and canoes sleeker than those of interior tribes. The Corps realized instantly that coastal cultures were remarkably adapted to river life, possessing knowledge built over countless generations. The Columbia also revealed signs of long-established trade networks. Native merchants carried copper, shells, beads, and woven blankets as currency. Lewis and Clark observed that these tribes regularly traded with coastal peoples who interacted with European and Asian ships. Some villagers possessed metal tools unfamiliar to interior tribes. This astonished the captains. They realized the Corps was entering a region connected to global commerce long before the United States imagined expanding to the Pacific. Emotionally, hope grew stronger. Clark wrote that men spoke constantly about reaching the ocean, imagining waves slamming against cliffs and sea birds circling overhead. Some sang songs describing homecoming. Yet this hope contained anxiety. If storms trapped them or conflict erupted, the Pacific dream could still collapse at the final moment. The Columbia River brought new diplomatic responsibilities. Tribes along this waterway were culturally distinct from those east of the mountains, possessing refined economic systems and elaborate social hierarchies. The Corps met the Umatilla, Walla Walla, and Yakama peoples, communities whose lives revolve around salmon fishing, trading, and ceremonial gatherings. Lewis noted that these societies were accustomed to interacting with strangers from distant regions. Foreign traders had visited the coast decades earlier, long before the Corps arrived. This meant diplomacy became more complex. While Mandan and Hidatsa diplomacy had centered on peaceful trade for survival in harsh plains, the coastal tribes expected carefully structured gift exchanges that demonstrated respect and political awareness. But the weather remained unpredictable. Thunderstorms rolled through valleys, sending lightning across mountaintops and reminding the Corps of upcoming danger. Snow ridges glittered ominously in morning sun, giving visual proof that the mountains were not ready to open. Still, spirits rose. The men tasted buffalo again, slept on dry grass, and breathed air free of ocean salt. They felt stronger, healthier, and mentally prepared for the trials ahead. The Corps realized that their success depended as much on friendship with native nations as on military skill. Without the Nez Perce, there would be no horses, no food, no maps, no safe trails. Lewis wrote that the tribe deserved lasting gratitude of our nation. Soon, the snow would melt, and the bitter roots would open their paths. Ahead lay exploration not yet completed, different return routes, new discoveries, and an eastern journey filled with danger equal to anything on the westward march. The Corps stood ready, not merely to go home, but to complete the mission of understanding and documenting a continent. In mid-June 1806, after weeks of patience and careful planning, the Corps Discovery finally prepared to cross the Bitterroot Mountains once more. Snow still blanketed the higher ridges, but warm valley air signaled that the mountain passes were opening, albeit dangerously. This region haunted the group with memories of hunger, freezing nights, lost horses, and near collapse. Not one man forgot how starvation nearly consumed them the previous autumn. Yet this time, they entered the mountains stronger, rested, well-fed thanks to Nez Perce generosity, and guided again by trusted mountain experts. Before departure, Lewis and Clark gathered the men for clear instruction. Pace would be slower, supply protection tighter, and daily routine more organized than before. They carried dried meat, pemmican, and packs of camas. Far more food than they had entering the mountains last time. Their horses were also healthier and more numerous, giving better pack distribution. The Nez Perce offered final warnings. Do not travel too quickly into upper snowbanks, avoid night crossings, and trust their scouts. Lewis and Clark took these words seriously. Old Toby, the original guide, did not accompany them this time. Instead, Nez Perce hunters escorted the Corps through the first phases of the ascent. The trails, though familiar in outline, had changed dramatically since the previous year. Meltwater had carved deeper ravines. Early spring avalanches had altered slopes, and fallen trees blocked traditional passages. The men used axes and raw strength to move obstacles. Even with horses, progress proved slow and exhausting. The mountain atmosphere changed psychology. Though fear lingered, there was also pride. The Corps walked the same ground that nearly defeated them, proving resilience. Sacagawea, carrying her child now older and heavier, moved with confidence. She pointed out the exact stretch where the Corps once starved and reminded the captains that survival here hinged on knowledge, not luck. Clark noted that her calmness reassured nervous men. Throughout the crossing, men experienced sensory memories that echoed their misery of 1805. Cold mountain winds revived memories of despair. Distant wolf howls resurrected fear. Yet the group kept moving, driven by the powerful idea of returning home victorious. Campfires at night burned brighter than before, with horses grazing on patches of mountain grass. They sang songs, told stories, and expressed gratitude for being alive. When the Corps descended into the Bitterroot Valley on the eastern side, relief overwhelmed them. They reached Traveler's Rest, an important landmark in present-day Montana, named earlier because its open grassland, clean water, and forest shelter made it a perfect resting ground. But at Traveler's Rest, Lewis and Clark made a major decision that would define the second half of their return journey. They would split the expedition into multiple teams to explore additional land before meeting again farther east. They had successfully crossed a continent. Now they intended to increase scientific and geographic knowledge even more. The decision to divide into groups reflected brilliant strategic planning. Lewis and Clark believed that the United States deserved more than a single mapped river route across the continent. They wanted to document plains geography, additional mountain passes, and native nations they had not yet met. They also needed to determine whether rivers like the Marias, Yellowstone, and Blackfoot tributaries might offer future transportation potential. This approach expanded their scientific purpose far beyond original expectations. Lewis took the northern detachment, planning to explore the Marias River Basin, a region he hoped might identify the northernmost boundary of the Louisiana Purchase. Clark would lead a separate southern detachment eastward, mapping the Yellowstone River and further defining the Rocky Mountain foothills. Meanwhile, smaller groups would escort horses, retrieve cache supplies, and rejoin the Missouri River system at different points. Sacagawea and her family traveled with Clark, largely because Clark planned to follow a familiar Shoshone-associated path toward the Yellowstone. Her mountain knowledge remained invaluable. York accompanied Clark as well, strengthening diplomatic encounters through his storytelling and physical presence. Lewis's group faced the first trials immediately. They traveled north across rolling plains populated by immense bison herds, antelope, and wolves. The landscape differed from river valleys. Grass grew waist-high, and thunderstorms erupted suddenly with lightning striking dangerously near horses. Lewis documented new plants and animals, marveling at the biodiversity unseen east of the Mississippi. He noted large prairie fires and wondered whether they were naturally occurring or intentionally set by tribes for ecological management. While Lewis conducted scientific exploration, Clark faced equally complex challenges along the Yellowstone. His route demanded new canoes carved from cottonwood trees. Under his direction, men shaped boats in record time and launched onto the Yellowstone River, which offered deep water and relatively calm current. Clark recorded odd golden rock formations, immense cottonwood groves, and incredible wildlife. He named geological wonders, including Pompey's Pillar, a massive sandstone formation honoring young Jean-Baptiste. Clark carved his name into the stone, a historical signature still visible today. Diplomacy continued to shape every step. The Corps met Crow and Cheyenne hunting parties, tribes known for strong horse culture and rapid movement across the plains. These groups stole several horses from Clark's camp, a reminder that tribal customs viewed horse theft as honorable wartime achievement rather than criminal theft. Clark accepted the loss as cultural reality rather than disrespect. Lewis's group, meanwhile, entered Blackfeet territory. For generations, the Blackfeet had defended hunting grounds fiercely and maintained rivalries with tribes like the Shoshone, Sacagawea's people. Lewis hoped for peaceful communication, but also recognized danger. The stakes rose even higher when Lewis learned that Blackfeet warriors had obtained guns from British traders. This discovery signaled international competition for Western influence. The United States was not alone in its ambitions. The encounter between Lewis's detachment and the Blackfeet in late July 1806 nearly turned catastrophic. Lewis and 3 companions met 8 Blackfeet warriors near the Two Medicine River. Initial interactions seemed hopeful. Lewis shared medals and flags, attempting diplomacy. Yet conversations revealed deep political tension. Lewis spoke proudly about U.S. plans to supply firearms to other tribes like the Shoshone and Nez Perce. To the Blackfeet, who relied on those rifles to maintain military dominance, this statement felt like threat and betrayal. In their worldview, weapons determined survival against rival tribes. Lewis's casual revelation carried severe consequences. That night, both groups camped together. However, conflict erupted when the Blackfeet attempted to steal the expedition's rifles. A violent struggle followed in the dark. Shots fired. Dust rose. Lewis's men killed 2 warriors, the only time during the entire expedition that Lewis and Clark's forces shed native blood. The aftermath deeply disturbed Lewis. He believed the fight was unavoidable but regretted political fallout. Realizing Blackfeet retaliation was likely, he and his men fled rapidly, riding nonstop for hours across rugged plains. Lewis wrote that if they had hesitated, they would have died. This incident, though brief, symbolized the complicated future of U.S. Native relations. Misunderstanding, competition for resources, weapon distribution, and cultural mistrust were already shaping what would become centuries of conflict. Lewis mourned the tragedy, not only for the young men who died, but for the future relationships now damaged. His journals showed grief and exhaustion rather than triumph. While Lewis retreated south, Clark's detachment continued moving east toward the Missouri River. His men reported joyful scenes of wildlife in numbers unimaginable. Bison herds in thousands, wolves in packs of dozens, and grizzly bears following animal migrations. Clark described moments when the horizon itself seemed alive with moving animals. Yet magnificent as the plains were, dangers persisted. A bull buffalo charged into Clark's sleeping tent one night, nearly killing him. He survived by inches, crediting quick reflexes rather than fortune. During the Yellowstone travel, Clark's group lost more horses to Crow raiders, who stole them silently under night skies. Yet unlike suspicion with other tribes, Clark respected the Crow for skill and bravery. He found their ability to track horses and vanish instantly almost admirable. As July ended, both expedition wings moved steadily toward reuniting along the Missouri River. The Corps had successfully expanded knowledge far beyond the original Missouri-Columbia Highway. They mapped vast plains, met powerful nations, understood rivalries, and collected scientific details unmatched in American history. Even with success, emotional weight grew heavier. Many men longed intensely for home. Wives, parents, siblings, sweethearts, and friends. They spoke about the smell of farms, the taste of fresh bread, and the sound of church bells on Sunday mornings. They dreamed of telling Eastern audiences about mountains, rivers, buffalo herds, and Pacific waves. Yet before reunion and celebration, danger remained. The Missouri River still lay before them, along with storms, heat, hunger, and distance. Still, the Corps moved forward fearlessly. They had crossed the continent, survived the Pacific winter, and now explored separate regions successfully without collapsing unity. As they approached the moment of reunion, they carried not only records of a continent, but memories that would define their nation's identity. By early August 1806, after weeks of separation and exploration, the Corps of Discovery began closing the distance between its divided groups. Each detachment had traveled hundreds of miles across rugged plains, rivers, and forests, collecting scientific notes, mapping geography, and forming new political relationships. The time now approached for the expedition to reunite along the Missouri River and travel home collectively. Lewis and Clark, though apart physically, maintained identical determination to complete their journey as a single corps, just as they had begun it. On August 11th, Lewis's detachment, exhausted from the violent Blackfeet encounter, pushed southward rapidly along the Missouri. Lewis still carried a painful gunshot wound, ironically inflicted by one of his own men, Pierre Cruzat, who mistook him for an elk while hunting in tall grass. The bullet pierced Lewis's thigh, lodging dangerously near muscle and bone. Though infection threatened his life, Lewis forced himself to continue riding, knowing delay risked separation from Clark and increased danger from Blackfeet retaliation. His journal entries from these days showed irritation and pain mixed with humor. He teased Cruzat about bad eyesight, insisting the accidental shot would become a story rather than a tragedy. Clark, traveling eastward on the Yellowstone, encountered his own hardships: heat waves baking plains into shimmering ovens, mosquitoes swarming in clouds thick enough to darken sky, buffalo stampeding dangerously close to boats, and riverbanks eroding under heavy summer water flow. Yet despite these challenges, Clark's morale remained strong. He anticipated reunion and believed the Corps would soon enter Commer territory. His journal writing grew lighter, filled with optimism about nearing home. At the confluence of the Missouri and Yellowstone rivers, the two parties finally saw each other's boats coming from opposite directions. Shouting erupted, hats waved in celebration, and men embraced across canoe rails as they drifted together into the same current. Clark wrote that the reunion was among the most joyous moments of the entire expedition, proof that leadership decisions, cultural diplomacy, and shared loyalty had kept them alive. The Corps, split for exploration, returned whole. After the reunion, Lewis and Clark compared notes about discoveries made while separated. Lewis shared geographic data about the Marias River and political intelligence from Blackfeet country. Clark described the Yellowstone's broad valleys and gave sketches of formations like Pompey's Pillar. Both captains marveled at the enormous expanse the Corps had mapped beyond even Jefferson's imagination. They reviewed journals, updated maps, and organized information with renewed purpose. Their expedition, once a single westward march, had evolved into a multidirectional scientific conquest. The Corps now faced the Missouri River as their highway home. The river carried them southward quickly, allowing the exhausted men to rest paddles and let current propel them. The landscape, now familiar, offered psychological comfort. They passed locations where they had camped nearly 2 years earlier. Memories of hope, confusion, and ambition resurfaced. Some men pointed out old campfires, discussing how young and inexperienced they had been on the outward journey. The river reminded them how much the world had changed and how much they had changed too. Yet danger had not disappeared. Hostile groups still roamed the region. Game animals remained unpredictable. Storms could strike without mercy. The river itself, wide enough to seem peaceful, still contained sandbars and snags capable of overturning loaded boats. But the Corps carried sharper awareness now. Knowledge gained from every disaster survived. They approached each day with discipline, caution, and pride, knowing they were no longer students of the West. They were masters of its geography. As the Corps journeyed south along the Missouri River through August and early September 1806, they passed familiar native territories. Diplomatic responsibilities resurfaced. Jefferson had instructed them to maintain relationships with indigenous communities, even on the return trip. They delivered final messages of peace, discussed future trade possibilities, and documented tribal responses to American presence. The Teton-Sioux region presented the greatest diplomatic risk. Memories of tension from the outward journey still weighed heavily. In 1804, the Teton-Sioux nearly halted the expedition, demanding toll payment and questioning American authority. Now, almost 2 years later, Lewis and Clark approached the same region, uncertain whether time had softened anger or sharpened resentment. Clark wanted to avoid conflict entirely. He instructed the Corps to stop only if necessary. Bands of Sioux watched the boats from riverbanks, raising dust clouds that blurred the horizon. Armed warriors rode horses along bluffs, tracking canoe movement. The tension was palpable. The Corps prepared weapons discreetly, ready to defend if attacked. Yet, surprisingly, no confrontation erupted. Lewis believed that the Corps' confident posture and clear determination to continue downstream convinced the Sioux to allow their departure without interference. The expedition breathed relief. War could have destroyed them so close to home. Other encounters were warmer. Friendly Iroquois and Mandan parties greeted the Corps joyfully. Leaders remembered previous councils and welcomed Lewis and Clark with corn, tobacco, and warm embraces. Clark especially enjoyed meeting old acquaintances, shaking their hands, and recalling memories from the winter of 1804 to 1805. The Mandan asked about Sacagawea and her child, thrilled to see the boy growing strong. Such reunions reminded the Corps that intercultural relationships had shaped their survival. They would not take the same exact route home. Instead, Lewis and Clark planned to separate into divisions to explore and map additional rivers and plains. They intended to expand scientific knowledge even during the return journey, refusing to treat the westward trek as the adventure's end. The Pacific Ocean, though breathtaking and unforgettable, represented only the middle of their mission, not the conclusion. Winter at Fort Clatsop demonstrated endurance and intellect over despair. It showed that exploration required not just courage, but adaptation, humility, and cultural respect. Despite suffering, the Corps strengthened their identity here. They were not simply travelers anymore. They were continental explorers preparing to bring knowledge east and permanently reshape the American imagination. As winter loosened its grip on the Pacific Northwest in March 1806, the Corps of Discovery prepared to leave Fort Clatsop and begin the long return journey to St. Louis. Though they had survived 3 months of relentless rain, hunger, cold, insects, and sickness, every man understood that what lay ahead would not be easier. Lewis and Clark knew that the homeward path required crossing the same mountains and river systems that nearly killed them the previous year. Only this time they faced the challenge with bodies weakened by constant exposure and spirits drained by damp ocean weather. Their clothing hung in tatters. Elk-hide garments were stiff with coastal salt, and rifle stocks had warped from months of moisture. Yet despite discomfort, the Corps felt unmistakable pride. They had reached the Pacific Ocean alive and returned with knowledge that would change the shape of American geography forever. The final days at Fort Clatsop involved preparation frenzy. The captains distributed elk hides to mend moccasins, re-oiled weapons, and replenished ammunition cases. The men dried meat, gathered salt, smoked fish, and traded with Clatsop villagers for fresh food. Clark walked the perimeter of the fort, noting structural rot that had already begun from near-constant rainfall, and commented that the wooden walls might collapse soon after their departure. This symbol emphasized an important truth. Fort Clatsop was meant for temporary survival, not permanence. The Corps carved signatures into the fort's entrance posts and packed away journals filled with observations about coastal tribes, ocean tides, new animals, and cultural differences. As their departure date approached, diplomacy with local tribes remained essential. The Chinook and Clatsop charge high trade rates, requesting expensive items like metal, beads, and cloth for basic supplies. Lewis grew frustrated at times, believing these tribes took advantage of the Corps' desperation. He wished they had saved more trade goods for the coastal stage of the expedition, but hindsight offered no solutions. Yet he also admired their intelligence and commercial skill. Coastal tribes understood the exact value of scarcity and supply. These negotiations provided insight into the Pacific economy, where competition for foreign trade would eventually shape American diplomatic strategy. On March 22, 1806, after a final cold night beneath dripping cedar roofs, the Corps of Discovery left Fort Clatsop behind. They paddled east along the Columbia River, rain stinging their faces like whips, wind slowing their boats, and fog blurring navigation. A few men turned to look back at the fort, its smoke still rising from chimneys as the river carried them away. It was a bittersweet departure. They were leaving the site of incredible achievement, but also of near despair. Lewis later wrote that he felt no regret leaving the coastal climate, calling it the most disagreeable country of any we have passed. Canine companion seaman, Lewis's loyal Newfoundland dog, led the way along riverbanks, barking at seals and sea lions sunning themselves on rocks. The men laughed despite exhaustion. Familiar animals and inland river landscapes reminded them that they were returning to a world they understood. Their greatest motivation now became speed. They longed for fresh buffalo meat, warm sunshine, dry earth beneath their feet, and eventually the sight of eastern cities. But emotional desire did not change the physical task. Nearly 4,000 miles still separated them from home. The journey west may have written history, but the return would prove whether the Corps could survive long enough to bring that history back alive. The upriver journey was far more difficult than the men hoped. Traveling downriver the previous autumn, they had flown along swift currents at exhilarating speed. Now, pushing upriver against powerful spring water demanded brutal labor. The canoes bounced heavily against waves as paddlers strained for each inch of progress. At times the river was so strong that men leapt into freezing water, dragging their vessels by ropes along rocky shorelines. Their shoulders ached, muscles trembled, and lips cracked from bitter spring wind. Yet they endured, driven by the desire to escape coastal storms and reach drier interior valleys. The return route also offered a chance to collect more scientific data. Lewis and Clark refused to simply retrace steps. They planned to explore new forks of the Columbia, document previously unseen tribes, and refine earlier sketches. Packs filled quickly with new specimens, drawings, and legends from native informants. They realized the expedition's legacy depended not only on reaching the Pacific, but on returning with layers of knowledge so deep that future generations could understand Western lands more accurately. Diplomacy grew more productive as they moved inland. Coastal tribes, used to commercial wealth, had demanded high trade values. Upriver tribes were more generous, offering roots, dried fish, and fresh meat. The Corps traded sewing needles, beads, and small metal tools to secure critical food for the journey. Sacagawea again transformed communication efforts, describing plants, terrain, and edible resources. At one riverside village, She helped the Corps acquire dozens of dogs for food, an unpleasant but necessary protein source. Lewis wrote that although the men disliked eating dog meat early in the expedition, they now preferred it to the fish-heavy diet of the coastal tribes. Navigation challenges increased beyond Celilo Falls. Rapids forced repeated portages. Canoes scraped against rocks, splitting edges and requiring patchwork repairs with pitch and hide. Tools broke. Paddles snapped in half during sudden current surges. The men worked endlessly on riverbanks, repairing damage, their bodies drenched from water exposure. Every night, they curled beside fires beneath dripping blankets, drying clothing over flames. Sleep came unevenly, often interrupted by coughing, shivering, or rain beating against camp canopies. Wildlife shifted as they traveled east. Seals disappeared, replaced by deer, wolves, and eagles again. Lewis recorded the presence of immense condors near canyon cliffs, birds with wingspans too wide to measure accurately in dim light. He described how these birds circled above corpses of salmon left along shores, feeding on carcasses that tribes considered unfit for eating. The further upriver they traveled, the more Sacagawea's attention turned eastward emotionally. Her homeland lay beyond the mountains, and she understood the return path intimately. She described shortcuts, warned of swamps, and directed the men away from dead-end river channels. The captains trusted her guidance completely. Several times, tribal informants contradicted her directions, yet Sacagawea proved correct each time, saving days of dangerous backtracking. Her knowledge was not merely cultural, it was geographic genius. Amid these efforts, men began dreaming about home. Clark wrote the name Pompey repeatedly in his journal, referring to Sacagawea's infant Jean-Baptiste by his affectionate nickname. He imagined telling stories to Eastern families about the bravery of that child who had crossed mountains and oceans from his cradle. York, Clark's enslaved servant, shared stories with villagers about American life east of the plains. Lewis listened to these conversations, reflecting deeply about cultural differences, hierarchy, race, and freedom. The Corps was no longer simply military structure. They had grown into a multicultural unit that defied traditional American identity. But ahead lay the Bitterroot Mountains again, the greatest symbol of fear on the return path. Lewis reminded the men that they must reach the mountains early enough to avoid deep snow. Speed was now survival. As April ended and May 1806 began, the Corps arrived in Nez Perce territory once more. The reunion carried emotional weight. The Nez Perce had saved their lives the previous year, feeding and sheltering them when starvation pushed them to the edge of death. The Corps expected welcome, and they received it. Villagers greeted them with handshakes, offered food, and expressed relief that the men had survived Pacific storms. The Corps built a temporary camp near Nez Perce lodges, repairing equipment and preparing for the mountain crossing. Here they discovered a new obstacle. The Bitterroot Mountains remained buried beneath dangerous snowpack. Even though spring's sun warmed valley soil and flowers bloomed along riverbanks, the high trails remained frozen death traps. The Nez Perce urged Lewis and Clark to wait weeks before attempting to cross. They promised that in June, the passes would open enough for horses to survive without slipping into ravines. Lewis faced a difficult decision. Wait and risk consuming irreplaceable supplies or proceed and risk losing men to mountain accidents. Ultimately, wisdom prevailed. The Corps waited. While living with the Nez Perce, the Corps strengthened relationships through trade, storytelling, and shared work. Lewis studied camas root harvesting traditions, observing how tribes baked roots in underground ovens for days to convert starch into sugar. He recorded that camas, though initially bitter to Eastern taste, provided nutritious calories. Clark spent time mapping new valleys and ridgelines unknown in 1805. He wanted their return route to include fresh geographic insight, improving American cartography dramatically. During these weeks, Sacagawea impressed the captains once again by interpreting new dialects and clarifying trail legends from Nez Perce hunters. She pointed out plant species that could heal infection, helping treat blisters and wounds. The men marveled at her endurance, carrying her young son on her back through daily activities. York continued interacting warmly with Nez Perce communities, who admired his physical strength and dancing. Several chiefs wondered aloud why York, a man so capable and charismatic, lived in slavery. Lewis recorded these comments quietly, recognizing that indigenous people saw freedom in ways Americans often denied. These interactions planted seeds of ideological thought that would resurface later in American politics. The Corps used their waiting period strategically. They purchased new horses, strengthened saddles, replaced moccasins, hunted deer, dried meat, and rebuilt gunpowder supplies. They played games, repaired clothing, and shared songs with villagers. Clark and Lewis taught American songs to children who laughed while trying to pronounce English lyrics. Bonds formed that transcended political boundaries. After Lewis and Clark, wilderness became a stage on which ordinary men could become extraordinary through courage. This belief soon shaped Western literature, cowboy mythology, and frontier legends. The Corps proved that resilience could define national character. Today, the memory of Lewis and Clark exists in museums, books, oral histories, documentaries, monuments, and place names across the United States. This cultural memory, however, evolved into multiple narratives: heroic, tragic, proud, painful, scientific, patriotic, and indigenous-centered. Modern historians emphasize that the expedition must be understood not as a single story, but as thousands of layered memories overlapping and sometimes disagreeing. In some regions, Lewis and Clark are celebrated without hesitation. Trails, bridges, schools, rivers, and parks carry their names. Communities hold reenactments and festivals. Children are taught to honor the Corps' bravery and scientific detail. The expedition is framed as proof of American perseverance and unity. In other regions, particularly native lands, the expedition is remembered more cautiously. Some tribes recognize the Corps as respectful explorers who listened and learned rather than conquered. They appreciate the ethnographic detail left behind, which helps preserve cultural memory. Yet they also understand that the expedition opened the door to government pressure, treaty fraud, land theft, and cultural suppression. For them, Lewis and Clark mark a beginning of irreversible change, a turning point that led to both recognition and suffering. Modern scholarship blends these narratives. Universities analyze Clark's maps using digital satellite comparison. Linguists study vocabulary charts for language revival. Ecologists examine Lewis's animal descriptions to reconstruct historic ranges. Psychologists analyze the emotional trauma evident in journals, exploring how leadership stress affected choices. Novelists reinterpret Sacagawea's life from feminist perspectives. Filmmakers reconstruct indigenous viewpoints using oral tradition. The expedition continuously evolves through reinterpretation. Even public conversations about race center around the expedition. York's involvement proves that African American individuals shaped early United States exploration. His presence challenges old assumptions that frontier success belonged only to white soldiers. York became a symbol of resilience against social injustice, showing that the Corps relied on his strength and diplomacy. Modern audiences now push to include York in textbooks, statues, and academic work. The Corps also appears within conversations about environmental conservation. Their journals describe ecosystems untouched by industrial damage. Buffalo populations numbering in millions, salmon rivers roaring with fish, wolves thriving across prairies. These images inspire debate about ecological restoration. Scientists use expedition data to measure how human activity changed landscapes. In that way, Lewis and Clark remain part of environmental activism centuries later. The cultural memory of the expedition continues shaping identity today because it touches universal human themes: adventure, survival, knowledge, loss, transformation, community, and destiny. Their story reveals how people change when confronted by something larger than themselves: mountains, culture, wilderness, or time. The Lewis and Clark expedition stands today not only as a defining American event, but as a global historical milestone. Around the world, the expedition remains a symbol of exploration, scientific inquiry, and cultural intersection. It represents a moment when humanity turned toward its unknown frontiers, not to conquer blindly, but to observe carefully, document respectfully, and learn humbly from people and landscapes previously hidden behind myth. In the early 19th century, the world was undergoing extraordinary transformation. Napoleon was reshaping Europe. Industrial machines were beginning to change economies. Revolutions inspired new nations, and scientific knowledge expanded rapidly. Within this context, the core of discovery served as North America's contribution to global Enlightenment science. Before Lewis and Clark, European maps of the western half of North America were filled with blank spaces or errors. Many believed that a direct water route to the Pacific existed somewhere across the interior, echoing centuries of mythic ambition. Others imagined that the continent contained deserts incapable of settlement or strange lost civilizations like European legends once claimed for Africa. But the core replaced centuries of speculation with clear, empirical truth. Their journals and maps drastically corrected global atlases. Cartographers in England, France, and Spain studied Clark's charts and immediately redrew continental outlines. The expedition provided elevation estimates, longitude readings, tribal locational markers, and river curvature details that were unmatched in precision for their time. Across the Atlantic, scholars understood that this was not a small expedition. It was a massive scientific achievement equal to voyages led by James Cook or Alexander von Humboldt. The Corps demonstrated interdisciplinary scientific method. Botanists used Lewis's plant notes to expand taxonomic classification. Zoologists integrated animal observations into evolutionary studies. Geologists studied references to mountain layering and volcanic formations along the Columbia River. Meteorologists examined weather pattern charts. Linguists relied on native vocabulary lists to compare language families stretching from the Great Plains to the Pacific coast. No other American document at the time captured such scale. But perhaps the most powerful world-level effect was psychological, proving that massive exploration remained possible even in the 19th century. Many Europeans believed that the age of true discovery had ended after Columbus, Magellan, and Cook. Yet Lewis and Clark showed the planet still contained remote wonders worth documenting. Their journey reminded nations that innovation and courage could still produce new knowledge. Their diplomacy also altered global political balance. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 had placed France and the United States into a complicated partnership. The expedition, by proving the region accessible, strengthened American territorial claim and weakened European ambitions in the interior. Britain's fur empire in Canada, Russia's Pacific coast interests, and Spain's claims in the American Southwest were suddenly threatened by U.S. proof of continental reach. For the United States, this global insight had deep meaning. The young nation gained legitimacy. not only by writing constitutions or passing laws, but by expanding scientific geography. The Corps of Discovery announced to the world that the U.S. was intellectually equal to Europe. Explorers from other countries wrote praises for the accomplishment, especially admiring the expedition's respect toward indigenous knowledge. All of this reveals the expedition's timeless truth. The world changes when humans choose to see instead of assume. Lewis and Clark rewrote Earth not through conquest, but through observation and endurance. Their legacy belongs to world history, not just American memory. The long-term future influence of the expedition touches nearly every field: education, law, literature, military logistics, transportation engineering, anthropology, environmental science, and cultural identity. Schools across the United States still teach the expedition as a foundational story, not because it is simply inspirational, but because it teaches method. It demonstrates to children that careful curiosity builds civilizations. Lewis and Clark did not rush blindly across land. They measured distances, recorded weather patterns, studied animals, and preserved languages. That practice became a model for future scientific work. The expedition shaped higher education as well. Universities today maintain Lewis and Clark research programs, analyzing original journals using digital systems. Students compare journal entries to satellite images to verify map accuracy. Others study Sacagawea's role to deepen understanding of indigenous women's leadership. Linguistic programs use Lewis and Clark vocabulary charts to reconstruct words nearly lost to colonial suppression. Psychology departments analyze expedition leadership decisions as case studies in group survival. The military still studies the Corps' organizational structure. Lewis and Clark managed logistics under extreme risk: ration distribution, weapon maintenance, morale management, group discipline, health organization, and decision-making under stress. Officers today examine how two leaders maintain unity without mutiny or desertion, despite starvation, freezing temperatures, and cultural uncertainty. Modern transportation also owes a legacy to the expedition. Their mapping helped determine future river commerce systems, railroad planning, highway placement, and even aircraft navigation corridors. The Corps proved the continent could support infrastructure, while correcting earlier myths that the West was barren, flat, or useless. City placement across Montana, North Dakota, Oregon, and Washington often followed geographic information first recorded by Clark. Environmental conservation movements also rely on their journals. Scientists reference original ecosystem descriptions to measure how rivers, forests, and animal populations have changed over 2 centuries. For example, Lewis recorded millions of bison across the plains, contrasting sharply with near extinction in the early 1900s. His descriptions of salmon runs along the Columbia now serve as comparison points for modern ecological decline. Conservationists treat the journals like time capsules that help rebuild natural systems. Literature, one of the most emotional forms of cultural inheritance, continues expanding the expedition narrative. American authors reinterpret themes of identity, wilderness, trauma, and discovery. Poems and novels use the Corps as metaphor for internal journeys, exploring grief, memory, love, and ambition. Sacagawea often appears in modern writing as a feminist icon, a cultural bridge, and a symbol of indigenous endurance. York has become a literary figure representing African American presence in early American exploration. Clark appears as a mentor archetype, Lewis as a tragic intellectual hero battling internal storms. The expedition also changed everyday language. Casual expressions like seek new horizons, uncharted territory, and Follow the Trail reflect concepts rooted in expedition imagery. The word core of discovery itself evolved into metaphor for any scientific team pushing boundaries. Space programs, ocean research, and medical innovation groups have adopted the title concept. Future influence extends beyond Earth. NASA has referenced the expedition when naming planetary missions, stating that Lewis and Clark symbolize human hunger to explore unknown realms, whether along rivers or across galaxies. Some astronauts even carry expedition quotes into space to connect past discovery with future frontiers. In this way, the expedition did not finish when its boats landed. It continues moving outward like ripples from a river stone, touching generations far removed from the original core. To understand the enduring meaning of the expedition, one must step back from geography and politics and focus on universal human themes: curiosity, courage, humility, and connection. The story of Lewis and Clark speaks to people not because of maps alone, but because it reflects internal human struggles. It shows what happens when individuals step into a world larger than their imagination and allow that world to transform them. The core of Discovery entered the West believing they would find rivers, mountains, and tribes. They did, but they also found themselves. They learned that fear does not vanish, but becomes fuel. They learned that knowledge requires vulnerability, and that leadership requires listening to those who were supposed to be followers. Clark trusted an indigenous woman as a river navigator. Lewis trusted native elders as scientific teachers. Their humility stands in contrast to later eras of arrogance. The journals show men laughing under stars after days of misery, sharing dinner even when food was almost gone. They reveal friendship stronger than hunger and storms. They show sacrifice, men carrying boats over rocky portages, Sacagawea walking through snow with her infant, York pushing upstream against racist assumptions. They show democracy. The core voted on major decisions, including where to live on the Pacific coast, a symbolic act broader than government expectations. The story also reminds today's world that exploration must include respect. The core did not treat the continent as empty land waiting to be claimed. Their journals are filled with admiration for tribal sovereignty, intelligence, and cultural beauty. They did not view Native Americans as obstacles. They saw them as scientists, diplomats, guides, and equals. If later politics betrayed that spirit, the expedition itself did not. Lewis noted the development of trade posts since their departure. French traders and American entrepreneurs had moved deeper into the region, creating early economic networks. He realized their findings would spark immigration waves and future settlement. His journal tone changed, excitement about progress mixed with concern about indigenous displacement. He understood that lands belonging to native nations for centuries might soon face cultural and territorial upheaval. The core carried this moral tension quietly. Despite diplomatic success, the core suffered new hardships along the river. Mosquitoes attacked relentlessly across swampy regions. The constant buzzing and biting drove men to rage and sleeplessness. The summer heat cooked meat supplies quickly, causing rot unless smoked over fires. Men tore clothing into smaller strips to create head nets and hand swatters. Clark wrote humorously that mosquitoes acted as the most cruel tyrants in all the land, reminding them that the West remained a place of challenge, not comfort. Meanwhile, Lewis continued recovering from his gunshot wound. He endured swelling, infection risk, and bleeding, yet never slowed the pace of navigation. Clark admired him deeply, praising his courage. Their partnership had endured every form of testing: starvation, snowstorms, grizzly bears, dangerous rapids, hostile diplomacy, and now injury. They had proven that leadership required emotional strength equal to physical skill. Each man had come to rely on the other not merely as commander, but as brother. Through all this, the Corps felt the excitement of success pressing closer. The Missouri River began to feel like a ribbon connecting them back to American towns. They imagined meeting civilians who had never heard of the Pacific or the mountains. People who believed the West remained distant fantasy. The Corps knew they were returning with truth, maps, journals, animal skins, plant specimens, and stories written across their bodies and scars. In mid-September 1806, the Corps approached the final stretch of their return, where geography shifted gradually from wilderness to cultivated land. Fields and small settlements began to appear along the Missouri River, a sign that they had reached the expanding edge of American civilization. For months, the Corps had traveled through unbroken landscapes without villages or farms. Now they saw livestock grazing near riverbanks, smoke rising from chimneys, and children playing outside cabins. These sights shocked their senses. Civilization felt strange and new after so long in wilderness. News of the Corps' survival did not precede them. Most Americans believed the expedition vanished long ago, lost beneath mountains or swallowed by unknown Western forces. Settlers stared wide-eyed at the ragged group passing downriver. They shouted questions. "Where have you come from? Is it truly you?" Lewis and Clark answered proudly. They had crossed the continent and returned. Word spread like wildfire along towns and farms. People ran to riverbanks cheering, waving hats, and offering food. The Corps, once isolated explorers, now felt like celebrated heroes. On September 20th, the expedition reached La Charrette, the westernmost permanent settlement near St. Louis at that time. The reception stunned them. Villagers cried with excitement, embraced the men, and asked endless questions. Clark wrote that he felt overwhelmed by the warm greeting. Dogs barked wildly, children pointed at Sacagawea's baby, and musicians played fiddle tunes to welcome them home. The Corps were not strangers returning. They were legends arriving. The next morning, they continued the final segment. Downstream, the Missouri widened dramatically, and familiar landscape emerged. On September 23rd, 1806, the Corps paddled into St. Louis to thunderous applause. Cannons fired in celebration. Bells rang from church towers. Citizens lined riverbanks, cheering so loudly that Clark struggled to hear his own thoughts. Men jumped ashore, shaking hands and laughing uncontrollably. Lewis and Clark stood in silence for a moment, absorbing reality. They had succeeded. They had traveled nearly 8,000 miles round trip, across plains, mountains, rivers, and forests, facing starvation, frostbite, disease, storms, and war risk. They had documented new animals, plants, languages, tribes, and geological wonders. They mapped a continent and shattered myths about geography. They proved that continental travel was possible and that the United States could reach the Pacific. The Corps delivered journals, maps, and specimens to territorial officials, preparing reports for President Jefferson. Their return marked not only personal victory, but national transformation. America now possessed knowledge that would drive expansion into the West for generations. Yet not all triumphs were joyful. The Corps carried memories of hardship, guilt over conflict with Blackfeet tribes, and concern about how future American settlement might impact native cultures. They understood their journey would accelerate change, good and painful. Still, the expedition ended in triumph. Lewis and Clark knew that their names would echo throughout American history, not for conquest, but for discovery, courage, science, and leadership. Their return to St. Louis marked the close of one of the most extraordinary journeys ever completed by human beings. The moment the Corps of Discovery returned to the United States, their lives changed forever. For 2.5 years, the men had been nearly isolated from the world they once knew. They had existed between native nations, inside uncharted wilderness, and across landscapes no American citizen had yet described accurately. As soon as they stepped onto the riverbank in St. Louis, they crossed an emotional border, from survival to legacy, from wilderness to civilization, from anonymity to fame. Houses, clothing shops, bakeries, churches, taverns, farms, and roadways appeared almost surreal to them after years of sleeping on ground soaked by rain or snow beneath endless night skies. The people of St. Louis celebrated wildly. Many citizens cried in disbelief, shouting that the explorers returned from the land of ghosts. Some believed the expedition had perished long ago. Newspapers printed their arrival within hours. Lewis and Clark were instantly recognized as heroes whose names would forever define the American frontier. The Corps members, once ordinary soldiers, found themselves surrounded by admirers seeking stories, artifacts, autographs, and details of the West. Their return marked the beginning of an era where public imagination about the frontier expanded into national identity. But fame did not erase exhaustion. The men looked older, thinner, and weathered by hardship. Muscles that once powered canoes across violent rivers now ached in unfamiliar beds. Their hearing buzzed with silence instead of wind, rushing water, and animal calls. Transitioning from wilderness rhythm to urban structure strained their emotions. Even eating at tables again felt strange. Many Corps members wrote later about awkward readjustment, describing how noise inside taverns overwhelmed them after months of quiet plains. President Thomas Jefferson received news of the Corps' successful return with pride and relief. In letters, he wrote that the expedition had fulfilled every expectation and more. Jefferson knew the Corps had proved that American expansion toward the Pacific was not myth, but destiny. He recognized that their maps, plant samples, animal descriptions, tribal interactions, astronomical calculations, and journals would transform science, diplomacy, and government policy. Before leaving St. Louis for the capital, Lewis and Clark organized their papers, verifying that no journal pages or scientific records were lost to river water or damp coastal climate. The documentation totaled thousands of pages of notes, descriptions of bison migrations, prairie ecology, tribal customs, languages, climate patterns, mineral deposits, river systems, and mountain geology. They had described over 100 plant and animal species not previously recorded by American science. Even more importantly, their maps stitched together enormous regions of the West, proving that geography could be understood, measured, and integrated into national planning. As the Corps prepared to travel eastward to Washington City, citizens continued visiting them daily. Children stared wide-eyed at Sacagawea's baby, Jean-Baptiste, now walking. Many asked how a child survived the entire journey. Clark responded proudly that the boy had crossed mountains before he could speak words. York attracted attention too. His stories fascinated crowds, and his physical presence made him one of the most memorable figures in the returning team. Yet under celebration, there remained a new, deep question. What would become of each individual after such a monumental journey? Returning alive was only the first step. The next challenge lay in finding purpose back in a world that suddenly seemed too small for men who had crossed a continent. When Lewis and Clark reached Washington City in early 1807, they entered the highest political stage of the young United States. Newspapers hailed them as national icons. Crowds gathered outside inns and meeting halls simply to see their faces. Artists sketched portraits. Journalists begged for interviews. Congress applauded their arrival, recognizing the expedition as one of the greatest accomplishments in American history. Lewis and Clark walked through the halls of government no longer as unknown captains, but as American legends. The enduring meaning lies in balance, triumph and tragedy, growth and loss. The expedition opened doors to scientific truth, but also to colonization. It produced cultural preservation and cultural disruption. It created national pride, but also national guilt. Holding all these truths together is the only honest way to understand its legacy. Today, thousands of people walk parts of the Lewis and Clark Trail for personal reflection. They hike mountain passes, paddle river segments, or visit historic sites to connect with something ancient and vast. Teachers use the expedition to spark curiosity in students who dream beyond classrooms. Tribal communities teach children about ancestors who met the expedition proudly and strongly. Historians continue discovering new insights in journals once assumed complete. The expedition therefore remains alive, not as a frozen chapter, but as a story constantly rewritten by new generations. Its meaning evolves because history itself evolves. When Lewis and Clark looked west at the Pacific Ocean, they believed they had reached the world's edge. They could not imagine that centuries later, humans would walk on the moon, explore Mars, and send telescopes beyond the solar system. Yet their spirit bridges that future, the determination to see, to understand, and to walk into the unknown. President Jefferson welcomed them to the White House with open arms. He questioned them eagerly for hours, listening to every detail: scientific information, tribal diplomacy, and geographic description. The captains presented maps, drawings, artifacts, and journals. Jefferson studied each detail with profound excitement. He understood that the knowledge they brought reshaped the entire world's understanding of Western North America. Lewis described the failure of the mythical Northwest Passage. He explained that instead of one continuous water highway to the Pacific, the West contained complex mountain structures, blocked river systems, and dramatic elevation contrasts. Jefferson understood the consequences. Future American expansion would require land routes, diplomatic coalitions with native nations, and eventually massive transportation investment. Not easy river sailing. Still, the West remained rich in land, animals, minerals, and agricultural potential. Reports about native nations carried equal importance. Lewis and Clark described each tribe honestly: strengths, cultural traditions, trade systems, political alliances, and spiritual beliefs. They emphasized that most native groups had treated them generously, even saving their lives. Jefferson recognized that diplomacy rather than warfare would define successful Western policy. Sadly, future government administrations would ignore much of Lewis and Clark's wisdom, choosing coercion instead of respect. Jefferson arranged rewards for the Corps, recommending grants of land and financial compensation. Congress approved payments, granting each enlisted man double pay and several hundred acres of land. Lewis and Clark received even larger land gifts and official appointments. Lewis was named governor of the Louisiana Territory. Clark became brigadier general of militiamen and superintendent of Indian affairs for the West. Their professional futures appeared bright, shaped by prestige, responsibility, and leadership in the new frontier. Meanwhile, scientific communities across the Atlantic reacted with astonishment. European scholars read translated reports describing animals like prairie dogs, grizzly bears, mountain sheep, and western elk. They studied botanical descriptions of camas, chokecherries, sagebrush, and ponderosa pine. Lewis's notes about meteor showers, lunar measurements, and climate variations fascinated astronomers. Suddenly, the West became a magnet of intellectual curiosity, attracting artists, scientists, writers, and future explorers. Even the Corps' journals changed culture. Their writing combined vivid storytelling and scientific method. People reading the descriptions heard wolves howl over midnight plains, saw buffalo herds rumble across open prairie, and felt the terror of crossing wild rivers and snowy peaks. In a world where most Americans never traveled farther than a few miles from home, these journals provided windows into unimaginable landscapes. However, despite praise, Lewis and Clark carried emotional complexity. They worried about future American impact on tribes they respected. They struggled with public expectations, knowing the West remained far more complicated than government fantasy suggested. And they understood that fame could be heavy, creating pressure none had experienced in the wilderness. The Corps had returned to a world eager to celebrate adventure, not absorb the truth about its costs. While national celebration unfolded, the Corps members quietly dispersed into separate lives, each man facing his own future. Their unity, forged across brutal winters, starvation events, river catastrophes, and cultural alliances, began dissolving into individual paths. Some soldiers returned to farming and frontier labor. Others entered military service again, fueled by excitement and adventure addiction. But their worldview was forever altered. The wilderness had imprinted itself onto their thinking, and many struggled emotionally to adjust to structured life. For example, George Shannon, the youngest Corps member, went on to become a lawyer and politician, using his expedition experience to shape leadership and public speaking. John Coulter, however, could not remain in civilization. Months after returning home, he left society again, returning to the West as a trapper. He became the first known white man to explore areas of present-day Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Park. Coulter's stories of geysers and burning earth sounded unbelievable to Eastern listeners, yet history later proved him correct. His path showed how wilderness could become home for some expedition veterans. Other men suffered emotionally. Some dealt with trauma from starvation and violent encounters. Many felt alienated. Town life lacked the unity and purpose the Corps had built. Their minds drifted nightly to memories of plains wind, mountain silence, and river music. They remembered laughter around fires, Sacagawea singing to her child, and Clark sketching maps by starlight. The West had become part of their identity. York's story also deepened in complexity. Having contributed physically and diplomatically during the entire expedition, York expected freedom as acknowledgement for years of service. His presence had impressed native groups, especially the Nez Perce and Mandan, who believed he held supernatural power or warrior strength. Yet upon returning to Kentucky, York learned he was still legally enslaved under Clark's authority. He asked for freedom multiple times, requesting that his years of sacrifice, hunting, and geographic discovery earn emancipation. Clark initially refused, angered by York's assertiveness. Their conflict represented a painful contradiction within American identity. A nation celebrating exploration and liberty still upheld slavery, even for national heroes. Years later, York did apparently achieve freedom, but his story exposed the uncomfortable truth behind American mythology. Sacagawea also faced a new life chapter. She had completed the most remarkable journey any woman in her era recorded. She returned to her Shoshone homeland briefly, receiving tribal respect and symbolic power. Later, she and Charbonneau traveled east again under government employment. Her son, Jean-Baptiste, eventually received schooling sponsored by Clark, who promised to guide the boy's future. Sacagawea's legacy grew, though her later life remains historically debated. Lewis himself began to struggle emotionally after the expedition. Though appointed governor of Louisiana Territory, he faced bureaucratic stress, political conflict, and financial trouble. The wilderness, where instinct guided him, had given him purpose. Government offices, paperwork and accusations of mismanagement drained his spirit. Darkness entered his journals. Several historians believe that trauma, exhaustion, and depression shaped his final years. In 1809, he died under mysterious circumstances, most likely suicide, ending the life of one of America's greatest explorers. Clark lived longer, shaping Western policy, maintaining friendships with native nations, and raising Sacagawea's son along with his own children. He named his eldest after Lewis, proving that partnership had deep emotional roots. Clark spent decades mapping, negotiating, educating, and protecting indigenous allies. The core of discovery did not fade into obscurity. They became symbols of courage, curiosity, and the American belief in pushing beyond the horizon. But beneath triumph lay the reality of sacrifice, tragedy, and personal struggle, a reminder that exploration reshapes everyone it touches. One of the greatest achievements of the Lewis and Clark expedition was not simply reaching the Pacific Ocean, nor surviving nearly impossible hardships, but transmitting a scientific legacy that permanently altered American knowledge and world geography. Their journey was the first detailed, government-sponsored scientific classification of the interior of North America. Before their return, the American West existed largely in a fog of myth and speculation. Filled with imagined rivers flowing through deserts without mountains, stories of mammoths still living in unexplored valleys, and theories that Western tribes lived in ancient Asian-style kingdoms. When the Corps returned, those stories shattered. They replaced fantasy with evidence. The expedition documented more than 122 new animal and bird species previously unknown to American science. They recorded the pronghorn, which Lewis believed outran every other animal on the continent, the prairie dog, whose complex social burrow system fascinated naturalists, the coyote, originally unknown to Eastern biology, the grizzly bear, which Lewis described as nearly unstoppable even after gunfire, and the mountain goat, which stunned them with agility across impossible cliffs. Their journals contained precise measurements, anatomical sketches, behavioral notes, and ecological analysis. In an era where scientific methods still evolved, the Corps' documentation stood as one of the most rigorous field efforts recorded. They also collected vast plant data, from camas roots to bitterroot flowers, pine varieties, sagebrush, and edible berries. Their notes provided direct knowledge of agricultural potential, nutritional values, medicinal properties, and tribal harvesting traditions. Lewis famously took personal interest in botany, pressing specimens between paper folds, labeling each with location, season, and altitude. Some plants described by Lewis were later named scientifically by European botanists, confirming that field study held international significance. But their impact extended even further. They introduced scientific respect for native ecological knowledge. Most European explorers before them had dismissed indigenous information as myth. Lewis and Clark, however, credited tribes repeatedly with accurate geographic landmarks, weather predictions, and botanical wisdom. They wrote that without the Shoshone, Nez Perce, Mandan, and many others, the expedition would have failed. Their scientific notebooks included native terminology, food preparation, fishing methods, and descriptions of spiritual ecological relationships. This cultural scientific approach set Lewis and Clark apart from earlier explorers who acted primarily as conquerors, not learners. Mapping might be the most monumental scientific product. Clark's maps changed the world's visual understanding of North America. Before the expedition, much of the continent's interior remained blank space or pure guesswork on global charts. Clark spent thousands of hours measuring river widths, compass headings, elevation shifts, seasonal water variations, and distance by latitude and longitude. His maps of the Missouri River system alone were so accurate that later steamboat pilots relied on them decades after the expedition. His cartography of mountain passes, plains, rivers, and coastal systems formed the basis for Western U.S. mapping long into the 1800s. Through their work, scientists and governments discovered that the Rocky Mountains were not a single chain, but a sprawling complex of jagged ridges and basins. They learned that rivers did not flow in neat continental symmetry. There was no single westward Mississippi equivalent. Instead, countless tributaries fed into separate basins. This discovery forced Americans to abandon centuries-old fantasies of a simple Northwest Passage. Their journals corrected centuries of European maps in one journey, proving that exploration must be rooted in real observation, not assumption. Beyond science, the mapping accomplishments reshaped American expansion policy. When the Corps returned, the United States government suddenly possessed a blueprint carved from direct experience rather than rumor. This blueprint motivated new trade routes, settlement plans, territorial negotiations, and military ambitions. Clark's maps, combined with Lewis's diplomatic assessments, became the foundation for the United States' eventual decision to claim Oregon Territory. Without the expedition, American leaders might never have believed that settlement and shipping routes across the Pacific coast were achievable. American newspapers printed large articles about the new lands. Some exaggerated stories claiming that western valleys overflowed with gold, pearls, and diamonds. Others focused on farmland potential, promising fertile soil beyond anything on the Atlantic coast. These writings encouraged thousands of families to dream west. Generations later, the Oregon Trail, a famous wagon migration route, was built partly along paths Lewis and Clark had documented. Every settler wagon heading toward Oregon in the 1840s and 1850s carried memories of Lewis and Clark's discoveries. Their maps, once ink on parchment, became American highways of culture. Trade also exploded. The Corps had recorded vast populations of beaver, otter, fox, elk, and buffalo. Fur companies recognized enormous profit potential. By the 1820s, trappers poured into the upper Missouri River system. Although commercial expansion strengthened the U.S. economy, it brought long-term consequences, ecological decline, and rising conflict with native tribes whose hunting territories became threatened. Scholars later recognized that the Corps had unintentionally opened the door to economic pressures that disrupted indigenous sovereignty. Military strategy changed as well. Understanding mountain passes meant armies could march west in case of conflict with foreign nations controlling coastal routes. Clark's maps helped secure later treaties with Britain regarding the 49th parallel border division between the United States and Canada. The West had become a geopolitical chessboard, and Lewis and Clark's data positioned the U.S. to compete. Meanwhile, scientific institutions in Philadelphia, Boston, London, and Paris requested copies of expedition notes. Lewis described new species to zoological boards. Clark submitted geographic revisions to influential mapmakers. For the first time, the American West appeared not merely as unknown wilderness, but as territory whose rivers, climates, and plant systems could be studied and predicted. Their work helped dismantle outdated European theories that the interior continent was barren desert incapable of supporting civilization. Instead, the Corps revealed massive farmlands, grasslands fit for livestock, and rivers capable of commerce. Even astronomy saw benefit. Lewis's celestial readings, recorded at countless locations, created data sets connecting longitude estimates to star positions. These calculations helped refine later geographic accuracy across the continent. Historians note that Lewis and Clark were not only explorers, but scientists carrying astronomical, meteorological, and natural history goals simultaneously. This multi-field mission made them national pioneers of interdisciplinary science. Their writing style also contributed to legacy. Unlike purely scientific reports, Lewis and Clark wrote narratives filled with personal emotion and vivid descriptions. In later publications, these journals captured public imagination. Readers smelled buffalo hides drying in camp smoke, felt ice water on skin during river crossings, and experienced thunder pounding against canvas tents. Their writing carved a storytelling tradition later used by frontier legends like Kit Carson and John Fremont. Their journals taught America how to romanticize exploration. But one of the most overlooked scientific contributions involved language documentation. Lewis and Clark wrote down dozens of native words from multiple language families, preserving vocabulary that might have vanished. They recorded pronunciation, grammar structure, and translation meaning. These linguistic records now help modern historians and tribal scholars reconstruct endangered languages. The expedition did not merely make maps. Its intellectual footprint touched anthropology, biology, astronomy, linguistics, ecology, geology, and ethnography. However, the expedition's scientific impact cannot be praised without acknowledging consequences and complexity. On one hand, their journals and maps empowered American society to imagine a national identity that stretched from ocean to ocean. On the other hand, their discoveries accelerated government interest in westward expansion, which ultimately led to displacement of native nations who had lived on those lands for centuries. The Corps themselves respected native cultures deeply and often advocated for peaceful coexistence. Their notes show admiration for tribal intelligence, political systems, and resource management. Lewis and Clark repeatedly explained that native communities were not primitive. They were sophisticated societies with distinct governance, economic networks, and spiritual systems. Sadly, later political leaders often ignored this respectful perspective. Instead, expansionist ideology, manifest destiny, emerged. Newspapers, influenced partly by the expedition's success, preached that Americans were destined to move west, regardless of existing civilizations. This belief created fierce conflicts through the 1800s, leading to forced relocations like the Trail of Tears and violent wars with Plains tribes. In that sense, the expedition could be seen as both a magnificent scientific triumph and a historical turning point whose long-term human costs were steep. Yet, despite future tragedy, the expedition itself remained committed to peaceful exchange. Lewis and Clark carried instructions to avoid violence, build alliances, and honor tribal sovereignty when possible. This goal shaped long-term anthropology. Their journals became primary ethnographic resources, used centuries later to understand pre-contact and early contact tribal life more accurately than colonial rumor ever could. Native descendants today sometimes describe Lewis and Clark not as conquerors, but as recorders, people who captured cultural identities with respect, even if the nation later failed to follow their example. The scientific legacy also shaped conservation principles. The Corps wrote repeatedly about declining buffalo herds near Mandan villages, drought patterns, and seasonal animal migrations. Their notes now serve modern ecologists studying climate change and habitat alteration. Without their systematic data, scientists would lack crucial baseline information about early 19th century ecosystems. Their work also encouraged cultural curiosity rather than fear. Before the expedition, many Eastern Americans imagined native tribes as monolithic groups with identical lifestyles. Lewis and Clark destroyed that stereotype. They described peaceful villagers building earth lodges on the Missouri plains, mountain warriors living nomadic horse cultures, coastal traders skilled in maritime navigation, and diplomatic councils more sophisticated than many European governments believed possible. Their journals taught Americans that cultural diversity existed even within tribal nations, offering nuance still studied in anthropology departments today. You just traveled across a continent through the eyes of Lewis, Clark, Sacagawea, York, and the native nations who shaped every mile of their journey. Today, you learned how science, bravery, diplomacy, and teamwork built one of the greatest achievements in North American history. You saw how the expedition mapped the West, documented new species, and built relationships with tribes whose cultures shaped the land long before America existed. But you also learned deeper truths. That discovery demands respect. That knowledge can inspire unity or conflict. And that history is never simple. It carries triumph and tragedy together. The moral of the story? Real exploration isn't about conquering land. It's about understanding it. It isn't about domination. It's about curiosity, humility, and cooperation. Lewis and Clark proved that courage can push human limits. Native nations proved that knowledge and survival run deeper than books ever described. Sacagawea showed that leadership has no boundaries of gender or age. York showed that strength and loyalty come from spirit, not status. Thank you for listening to this journey with History Teller Whitey. If you enjoyed this story, if it moved you or inspired you, then subscribe, return again, and walk with us through more pages of the past. Because here, history never sleeps. Here, every story has a voice. And here, the next adventure is waiting. See you again on the next episode, only on this channel. Stay curious, stay brave, and never stop exploring history. Finally, the expedition altered the psychological geography of America. Before 1806, the West existed mostly as legend, a dream painted in imagination. After their return, the West became real. People now knew distances, soil quality, weather cycles, and mountain dimensions. Maps now showed actual river curves rather than blank white spaces. Americans no longer fear that the West might hold ancient monsters or endless deserts. They viewed it as reachable land, wild, beautiful, and filled with opportunity. In modern times, Lewis and Clark's scientific achievements continue to inspire scholarship, art, museum exhibits, and documentary filmmaking. Their legacy survives not because of fairy tales, but because of measurable detail and human curiosity. They prove that the unknown could be understood, and that understanding brings power, not only for nations, but for knowledge itself. While American history textbooks often describe the Lewis and Clark expedition through the triumphal lens of national achievement, the journey also existed within a larger cultural world shaped by indigenous perspectives. For native nations who lived across the West long before the United States imagined expanding to the Pacific, the arrival of the core discovery represented not only curiosity and friendship, but also concern, caution, and prophecy. Understanding how native communities interpreted the expedition is crucial to understanding the deeper meaning of American expansion. Many tribes viewed the core as a group of wandering diplomats or spiritual messengers. When Lewis and Clark first met the Mandan and Hidatsa at the Missouri River villages, the tribe saw them not as conquerors, but as visitors entering an already thriving trade world. The Mandan believed the core represented opportunity, trade access, military potential, and future alliances against regional rivals. But they also sensed danger. Elders warned that these men came from a distant world that might eventually demand land and obedience rather than partnership. The Shoshone carried mixed feelings as well. Sacagawea's reunion with her brother Kamiway changed the expedition's future, yet the tribe understood that providing horses might indirectly assist American dominance. Shoshone people had suffered decades of war with Blackfeet warriors. Providing horses to Americans felt like strategic insurance against future isolation. Yet oral legends later described Lewis and Clark as the first sign of a powerful wave that would one day alter tribal lands forever. The Nez Perce, who saved the Corps from starvation in 1805 and again sheltered them in 1806, offered a different interpretation. Their oral histories often described the Corps with admiration, calling them honest, respectful, and curious. They remembered Lewis and Clark as people who listened carefully, asked questions about customs, and treated them with dignity. Some stories describe how elders believed the Corps were sent by the Creator as signs of earth changing. However, later generations of Nez Perce looked back with sadness, recognizing that American entry into the West eventually led to broken treaties and forced war, including the 1877 flight of Chief Joseph. The Blackfeet encounter told another side of the story. For Blackfeet warriors, the Corps represented the opening of a dangerous new world that threatened tribal balance. The violent clash in 1806, where 2 warriors were killed, became part of Blackfeet cultural memory. To them, Lewis's comments about arming enemy tribes signaled the arrival of an empire intending to weaken their power. Their interpretation was not misjudged. The arrival of rifles among Shoshone and Nez Perce did in fact shift future territorial power structures. Even coastal tribes observed the Corps through lenses shaped by maritime trade. The Chinook, Clatsop, and Tillamook had already interacted with British, Spanish, and Russian ship crews for decades. They saw Lewis and Clark not as the first Westerners, but as newcomers lacking trade volume and goods compared to larger global markets. American explorers expected to impress these tribes with beads and medals, but coastal leaders treated such trinkets as insignificant, preferring iron, cloth, and industrial goods. From their viewpoint, the Corps were simply new trading partners, not gods of destiny, but men desperate for local knowledge. Ultimately, Native nations saw the Corps not as conquering armies, but as explorers on the edge of foreign identity, uncertain, hungry, respectful in some places, and dangerous in others. Their reactions were shaped by geography, tribal customs, trade history, and political rivalries. Only in hindsight did tribes understand how deep the consequences of the expedition would run. Long-term cultural impacts emerged slowly, like shadows expanding across land. In the years immediately following the expedition, very little changed on the surface. Native villages continued hunts, traded with their neighbors, raised families, and practiced ceremonies. The Corps did not build forts, seize territory, or leave soldiers stationed across the West. Many tribes believed the expedition was simply a diplomatic visit, an unusual event, but not a sign of future invasion. However, beneath daily life, the expedition planted seeds of transformation that grew rapidly by the 1820s and 1830s. The most significant change involved information. Lewis and Clark brought back detailed descriptions of plains agriculture, mountain valleys, timber sources, and river navigation. These descriptions inspired waves of settlers, army engineers, fur traders, and missionaries. White migration gradually infiltrated the West, first in small trickles, then in powerful river floods. The fur trade represents one of the earliest consequences. The Corps documented enormous beaver populations, unintentionally signaling profit to Eastern investors. Within 15 years, the Upper Missouri region swarmed with fur companies like the American Fur Company. Trappers built posts near Mandan villages, altering economic networks and cultural interactions. While some native individuals benefited through alliance and employment, others lost territory and traditional hunting grounds. Disease transmission also followed. though the Corps themselves brought no major epidemic westward. The route they mapped allowed future infected travelers to reach native communities. Smallpox, which had previously devastated eastern tribes, appeared again along the Missouri River in the 1830s, killing thousands. The expedition did not cause these tragedies directly, but their successful documentation created pathways for outsiders who later carried disease unintentionally. Diplomacy shifted too. Before the Corps, many tribes saw themselves as autonomous worlds, independent from distant American politics. But Lewis and Clark introduced a new political idea. The United States claimed legal authority over the Louisiana Territory. They offered medals to chiefs, symbolizing political hierarchy. A U.S. president sat above tribal heads. Some tribes accepted these medals as trade ornaments. Others feared symbolic submission. Over time, these innocent symbols, misunderstood in the moment, became legal justification for treaties that stripped tribes of land. Language changed as well. Words borrowed from the expedition became roots of cross-cultural vocabulary. English terms like peace pipe, prairie, medicine, and chief entered native translation systems. Native words like Sioux, Shoshone, and Nez Perce became part of American language, though often distorted or mistranslated. Technology transfer had profound effects. Steel tools replaced bone and stone systems. Rifles replaced bows. Metal arrowheads increased hunting efficiency, but also intensified warfare. The Corps did not spread technology intentionally, but their journey contributed to a chain reaction in which modern material culture entered regions that had functioned on traditional ecological systems for thousands of years. Even spiritual thought shifted. Many native groups interpreted American arrival through prophecy. Some believed white strangers represented ancestral spirits returning in changed form. Others believed their arrival signaled a turning cycle foretold by the shamans long before. Tribes debated whether the Corps symbolized opportunity or destruction. In classrooms today, Lewis and Clark are often taught as solitary heroes battling wilderness. But from native perspectives, the expedition marks a meeting between civilizations. One ancient and rooted, one ambitious and expanding. Their cultural intersection reshaped philosophy, politics, and identity on both sides of the frontier, despite the unintended consequences of westward acceleration. The journals of Lewis and Clark remain some of the best preserved indigenous ethnographic records before the United States government imposed reservation boundaries. Their writing shows tribes living with sustainable economies, strong social networks, and sophisticated ritual structures before federal expansion policies altered traditional lands. They described Mandan corn storage, Hidatsa agricultural systems, and Shoshone horse culture. They detailed Nez Perce root processing, Chinook salmon trade, Salish diplomacy rituals, and Lakota war strategies. Their records showed tribes negotiating intermarriage networks, clan leadership, warrior responsibilities, hunting laws, and river navigation rights. Without these writings, much pre-colonial cultural context would be dramatically weakened. Modern tribes today study the expedition journals to reclaim historical identity. Many native historians criticize inaccuracies or judgmental language in Lewis and Clark's descriptions, but they also acknowledge that these sources preserve lost traditions. For instance, Nez Perce oral historians compare botanical notes with tribal stories to revive camas harvesting. Blackfeet scholars analyze the expedition's battle account to understand early relationships with foreign military structure. Shoshone communities celebrate Sacagawea's memory as living proof of indigenous presence at the foundation of American expansion. National parks, museums, and tribal cultural centers now use Lewis and Clark information to support land claims. rebuild native languages, and correct school textbooks. Scholars argue that Lewis and Clark unintentionally empowered future indigenous rights movements. Although the United States later committed violent acts of removal, assimilation, and cultural suppression, the journals remained untouched by propaganda. They contained raw truth, tribal life before disruption. Still, irony is powerful. The Corps respected native wisdom and rarely imposed on tribal societies. But their success gave American leadership confidence to attempt settlement of western regions. Jefferson envisioned farms stretching to the ocean. Later presidents believed those farms required native displacement to succeed. The Corps themselves had warned against policy aggression, but their voices became overshadowed by political ambition. Reflecting on these dual truths, knowledge preservation and cultural dismantling, shows why the Lewis and Clark expedition remains emotionally complicated. It represents the best of human exploration: courage, curiosity, documentation, intercultural respect. Yet it also symbolizes the beginning of national expansion that cost native nations land, resources, and autonomy. Even so, native culture endured. Today, descendants of the Mandan, Hidatsa, Shoshone, Salish, Nez Perce, Chinook, Tillamook, Lakota, Crow, and Blackfeet preserve traditions despite centuries of pressure. Modern tribal governments remain sovereign. Languages are being revived. Storytelling ceremonies continue. Native artists paint buffalo hunts remembered from ancestor experience. Lewis and Clark's expedition did not erase indigenous worlds. It simply intersected with them at a critical turning point in North American history. The journals stand as reminders that every nation, every river, every landscape tells more than one story. Historical truth belongs to multiple voices, not just explorers, but those whose lands shaped their journey. The Lewis and Clark expedition did not merely transform geography and science. It reshaped the minds and identities of the people who lived through it. When the Corps of Discovery left St. Louis in 1804, the men were young, disciplined soldiers trained to obey orders and survive physical hardship. When they returned in 1806, they were no longer ordinary military figures. They were explorers whose inner worlds had stretched far beyond the boundaries of early American belief. Many members later described a profound emotional fracture that appeared the moment they stepped back into cities and towns. The noise, the walls, the expectations of domestic American life felt overwhelming. They had spent years under open sky, surrounded by wild landscapes that taught them patience, courage, and silence. Civilization now sounded unnatural. Survival conditions shaped self-understanding. In the wilderness, men learned they could endure starvation, climb cliffs that seemed impossible, cross rivers filled with deadly currents, and face predators like grizzly bears without collapsing into panic. The expedition forced them to discover abilities they never believed existed. They mastered new languages, built tools on the spot, navigated by moonlight, and turned nature into teacher rather than enemy. These lessons remained with them forever, changing their sense of identity. Many members struggled to resume ordinary lives because daily problems, tax payments, crop planting, marriage routines, now felt trivial compared to memories of continental adventure. Lewis suffered most visibly. Although he became territorial governor, his mental state began declining shortly after returning. Historians now understand that he carried trauma from expedition pressures, leadership responsibility, survival fear, and the tragic Blackfeet encounter. Sleeplessness, self-doubt, financial trouble, and political stress weighed heavily on him. His journal tone changed dramatically from expedition excitement to inner torment. Some scholars believe he suffered post-traumatic stress disorder long before the term existed. The wild mountains and rivers had offered meaning. Political bureaucracy offered chains. His mysterious death in 1809, whether suicide or murder, symbolizes the emotional cost of exploration. One of the greatest heroes of the American frontier could not find peace within the society he served. Clark responded differently. Exploration strengthened his confidence and expanded his compassion. He maintained long relationships with tribes he met on the expedition, serving as a diplomat for decades. His identity fused leadership with cultural understanding. He refused to abandon the friendships or knowledge the expedition had given him. Clark adopted Sacagawea's son, showing emotional loyalty that crossed racial and cultural boundaries. His maps and journals became lifelong reference tools. He never stopped exploring ideas. Unlike Lewis, Clark thrived in the period after the expedition, using the past not as a burden, but as a foundation. Other members fell between these extremes. Some returned to farming and never again sought adventure, their identities turning inward toward family and land. Others, like John Coulter, felt compelled to continue westward, finding peace only in the wilderness. Coulter's decision to re-enter uncharted land immediately after returning suggests that some expedition members belonged more to nature than to town civilization. Stories like these show how exploration reshapes human identity, revealing that deep wilderness exposure can permanently alter emotional needs. The expedition also shaped national identity, teaching Americans who they believe themselves to be. Before Lewis and Clark, the United States existed mostly as a coastal republic built along rivers flowing into the Atlantic Ocean. Ideas of citizenship, culture, and destiny were rooted in eastern cities. After their return, Americans began imagining the nation differently, not just as a cluster of states along the ocean, but as a continental power reaching toward mountains, rivers, forests, and western shores. Newspapers published dramatic descriptions of buffalo herds, jagged peaks, glowing sunsets, and vast prairies. These landscapes entered American imagination and storytelling. Artists painted scenes inspired by journal entries. Poets wrote verses describing thunder rolling through Montana valleys or elk moving silently across Washington forests. Writers claimed that the United States held a natural destiny to expand west, using the expedition as symbolic proof. Although early members of the Corps never promoted conquest, later political voices turned their scientific journey into ideological ammunition. Manifest Destiny emerged partly from the cultural memory of Lewis and Clark, the belief that America was chosen to fill the continent. The expedition also changed how Americans viewed native tribes. Before Lewis and Clark, most Eastern citizens knew little about indigenous life beyond myths or fear. The journals provided descriptions of government councils, agricultural systems, artistic traditions, spiritual stories, and hospitality rituals. Many Americans, reading these accounts, gained empathy and curiosity. However, other readers saw opportunity for exploitation, believing that cultural differences made displacement acceptable. In this way, the expedition became a mirror that revealed American character. Some saw partnership, others saw domination. Memory of the journey began shaping education. Schools taught children about Sacagawea and the Shoshone providing horses, about the Nez Perce saving the starving Corps, and about Mandan hospitality that sustained the expedition through winter. These stories painted native nations as essential contributors to American history, even if later government policy ignored those truths. The cultural memory of Lewis and Clark built a foundation of admiration and guilt that future historians would continue examining. Psychological transformation occurred on societal scale too. Americans learned that the world contained more than their farms and towns. They realized that distant landscapes held new climates, new species, and new human relationships. This expanded worldview encouraged scientific curiosity, migration, and cultural blending. Families that once dreamed only of farming in Kentucky now imagined Oregon valleys. Children grew up wanting to see the mountains described by Clark. Even those who never left home felt the West calling through imagination, shaped by journal entries read aloud in taverns or printed in newspapers. Americans also began seeing wilderness as a place of heroism. Before the expedition, the West was considered a dangerous void filled with fearsome land.